everyone, and welcome to our final Knowledge by the Slice lecture. I'd like to introduce for you Dr. Benjamin Nathans from our history department for your lecture today.
Good afternoon, everybody, or should I say bon appetit? I'm very pleased to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to address you in a somewhat less formal scenario than usual. And it's nice to see some familiar faces from various courses in years past. I want to take you back to 1957 and the first International Youth Festival sponsored by the Soviet government to bring young people from all over the world, from dozens of different countries, thousands of them, to Moscow to showcase the new Soviet Union, the new superpower, and to introduce them to the treasures of Soviet culture. And I want to look at this experience briefly through the eyes of a young art historian who wrote a memoir of that experience. His name is Boris Shragin. And he was what we would probably call a graduate student at the time. And he was assigned to be a translator and tour guide to foreign art critics, young art critics. Youth Festival was defined kind of elastically. So his job was to take busloads of foreigners around and show them some of the studios of the great masters of Soviet socialist realism. And in particular, he found himself conducting a tour of the studio on the outskirts of Moscow of the president of the Soviet Academy of Arts, a man named Alexander Gerasimov, who had made a name for himself by painting those, you've probably seen them, gigantic murals, larger than life-size murals, a kind of neoclassical realist style with fawning images of great Soviet leaders like Stalin and Voroshilov. In other words, he was a party hack who did the bidding of the leaders in the Kremlin and whose aesthetic style conformed precisely to that was dictated by the party. And on his way up the ladder, he had crushed various other artists who had had the temerity to try other styles that departed from the official norm. And Shragin was more sympathetic to these nonconformist artists. And at some point, he got so nauseated by his task of showing off the labor of this artist whose work he despised that he turned to one of the foreign visitors and in an initial attempt to build a bridge, this other visitor happened to be an art critic from Tokyo. He turned to him and he said, in the international language of art, "Merde, crap," gesturing towards one of Gerasimov's paintings. And the two gradually struck up a dialogue in sort of broken English and French, which was all they had at their disposal. And at one point, this art critic from Tokyo turned to Shragin and asked him a question. And the question was, "When did your eyes open?" This is what Shragin writes about this in his memoir. "When did your eyes open? I was unable to answer. And not only because I couldn't find the words. Eyes open to what? Alexander Gerasimov had never been my ideal. When did your eyes open? I heard this question many times after I emigrated. Or, in an even simpler form, when did you become a dissident? It's impossible to answer because within the question itself lies a willful distortion of reality. Just as the ancient sophists used to ask, when did you stop beating your parents? If you stopped, that means you used to beat them. If you didn't stop, that means you continue to beat them. But I didn't beat them, ever. This question of why certain Soviet citizens became dissidents has long fascinated observers of the world's first socialist society, and I count myself among their ranks. When it first emerged in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, dissent took everybody by surprise. And by dissent, I mean unauthorized public gatherings, circulation of uncensored works in informal so-called samizdat form, the arrest of nonconformist intellectuals and artists. All of this ensemble of behaviors and activities caught everybody off guard. The Soviet authorities had assumed that they had successfully created a classless society and that the sources of this kind of dissenting behavior had been removed because class conflict was the source of antisocial behavior. And so if there's no more class conflict, there shouldn't be any such behavior. Western analysts had typecast the Soviet Union as the archetypal totalitarian society in which everything is ordered from the top down. And not only don't people dissent, they don't even think about dissenting because their minds have been brainwashed from the center. And so again, this kind of public manifestation of disagreement with official norms took people off guard. And interestingly, the attempt by the two sides to explain this phenomenon also displays a curious parallel. Soviet officials reflexively assumed that this kind of dissenting behavior was anti-Soviet, that it was essentially a form of treason. And since they were unable or unwilling to contemplate the possibility that homegrown Soviet citizens, people who'd been born and raised in this society, could somehow arrive at anti-Soviet views, they routinely ascribed this kind of activity to the influence of foreigners, which meant emigre organizations, Western intelligence services, spies, etc. And in a roughly analogous way, the Western commentators on the Soviet scene in the 1960s also assumed that these dissidents were essentially surrogate soldiers of Western liberalism, that if they were speaking this way, they must be speaking our language, they must represent our values, they must be our representatives internally in the ideological battles of the Cold War. Now, this sense of surprise, especially surprise among foreigners, was not lost on the dissidents themselves. One of the more prominent ones to emerge, a man named Andrei Amalrik, who briefly became famous all over the world for an essay that he released. I say released and not published because he couldn't publish it in the Soviet Union, but he circulated it underground under the title, "Will the Soviet Union Survive Until 1984?" A question that no one really had thought to ask because it seemed self-evident that not only was it surviving, it was thriving as the other superpower. And as he put it in that essay, to watch Westerners react to the efflorescence of dissidents in the Soviet Union was like watching an ichthyologist discover a talking fish. Ichthyologists are people who study fish. So it was if, for the first time, inside this, can you hear me without the standing mic? Yep. Inside this gigantic aquarium, if you will, that was the Soviet Union, suddenly native informants had been found who could not only speak, but who looked like they were and sounded like they were speaking their own minds. And if you look at the titles of works by dissidents that were smuggled to the West in these years, it sort of echoes that phenomenon. So you have books with titles like Sakharov Speaks, referring to Andrei Sakharov, the Soviet nuclear physicist who became a member of the dissident movement. Books like Alexander Solzhenitsyn Speaks to the West, Solzhenitsyn being the author of the first expose of life in the Gulag under Stalin. And for a while, it looked like the sheer existence of people like Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn and Amalrik had taken the total out of totalitarianism, were symptoms of the possibility that this system really was no longer conforming to the model of complete control, complete mind control. And it was not, I would say, without some irony that the dissidents became the darlings of the right wing in the United States, precisely the people who were the champions of the totalitarian model as the explanatory key to everything Soviet. So the very people that were calling into question that model were adopted by those who upheld it in the West. Now, by the early 1980s, the Soviet dissident movement had been virtually crushed by the KGB through a combination of exile of people to the West or internal exile of people like Sakharov to deep inside the Soviet heartland, out of reach of contact with Westerners or really with other dissidents, with imprisonment, including imprisonment in psychiatric hospitals and the use of psychotropic drugs against people whose mental health could not be really questioned. But the dissidents surprised the world a second time in the 1980s when virtually everything they had been saying, including their very vocabulary, came back to life, this time from the mouth of the occupier of the top seat in the Kremlin, Gorbachev, whose vocabulary of transparency or glasnost, of democratization, of restructuring the Soviet system, of rule by law, of openness towards the realities of Soviet history, all of this appeared to have been taken from the playbook of the dissidents themselves. So for a second time, the dissidents stunned the world with this seeming reversal of their fortunes and the way that their goals seem to be now emanating from the very top of the Soviet pyramid. Now, it's true that after the Soviet Union collapsed, or even in its waning years, very few Soviet dissidents were able to vault themselves to power, in contrast to their counterparts in Eastern Europe. So whereas in Poland you had Lech Walesa, in Czechoslovakia Václav Havel, in Hungary various lesser figures briefly but prominently coming into power as communism was crumbling, in the Soviet Union, with just a handful of exceptions in small peripheral republics, dissidents did not come to power. Some of them, though, did achieve modest positions of influence, including Sakharov himself, who was elected to the Congress of People's Deputies. A woman named Ludmila Alexeyeva, who had been exiled to the West, came back and became head of a nonprofit NGO dedicated to human rights. And there are a handful of others. These people now appeared to the world to be kind of prophets of perestroika, people who had seen the light before their time and whose ideas were now being vindicated, if not by them directly, then by people who had taken over their ideas. And when I say their ideas, I mean ideas about fundamental human rights, civil society, and the rule of law. Well, things look very different in Russia today. I think it's fair to say that the level of disenchantment with the dissidents and their legacy is as intense as the disenchantment with socialism itself. And for a third time, observers of the Soviet Union in the West, like me, are scratching their heads in bewilderment as Russians appear to be dismissing the very people who would seem to be leading candidates for freedom-fighting versions of a usable past, a kind of thread within Soviet history that would seem to be very valuable for promoting democratic values today. In fact, the typical attitude towards the dissidents in Russia today is either one of complete indifference or of casting upon them the blame for Russia's precipitous decline as a world power and, frankly, as a functioning economy in the 1990s under Yeltsin. So dissidents either get the rap for the Soviet Union's collapse in a negative sense, or they are simply seen as irrelevant to that history entirely. And in fact, a new generation of Russian scholars, historians, and sociologists is now recasting the dissident phenomenon as one of the pathologies of the late Soviet era. A group of people who were committed to the same kind of moral absolutism as their counterparts in the Communist Party, who were trapped, in a sense, inside the same closed world of absolutist values as their erstwhile opponents. And in fact, human rights itself is coming under a kind of multipolar attack or maybe critique as being a utopian project that is simply unable to respond to the realities of the ebb and flow of political life and has an unrealistic utopian project of imposing absolute moral standards in a way that it will never be realizable. And all of this unanticipated history, this series of surprises and then the surprising silence or criticism of dissidents in today's Russia has led me to ask myself the question, since I'm working on them, why should we be interested in these people today? What is it about the history of Soviet dissent that is interesting now in the year 2011? And I want to offer a couple of suggestions and then elaborate on my story a bit before concluding and leaving some time at the end for you to ask questions, and I hope get you out of here by 1 p.m. because I know some of you have classes. So for me, the interest in the Soviet human rights movement is part of a larger interest in the history of human rights itself, and particularly in the project of looking at the fate of human rights as a theory and as a set of practices outside their birthplace, outside the Western world, outside the Atlantic world. And in fact, to look at them precisely in some of the most unlikely settings for them to exist and flourish, namely settings like late Soviet socialism. I think this is an important project, not just because those parts of the world are interesting and matter, but because until we do this kind of work, I think we'll be stuck in a feedback loop that always perceives human rights as Western export products, whether they're exported in the form of texts or on the barrel of a gun under the rubric of a humanitarian intervention, such as we are quite familiar with. So expanding the circle of human rights history to contain and absorb areas that are not thought of as their classic breeding grounds, I think is important in the larger project of globalizing what is now undeniably a global history. A second reason is to examine yet again, but more carefully, the causes for the Soviet collapse. I don't think that the entire significance of what happened with dissent in the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s can be subsumed under the idea that it contributed X or Y or Z to the collapse of communist power. But I do think that that is an important role that they played in terms of hollowing out the moral legitimacy of those regimes, not only in the Soviet Union, but perhaps even more in Eastern Europe. And finally, a third reason why I find the topic compelling, and maybe I'll persuade you that you should too by the end of the hour, is that precisely because dissidents stood up for ideas like freedom of speech, freedom of association, the rule of law, the entire menu of fundamental human rights as codified in various documents, some of them American, some of them sponsored by the United Nations. Because of all this, anybody who takes those ideas seriously, and I think it's difficult not to take them seriously in this day and age, cannot be indifferent to their fate outside the West. The rhetoric of rights, and here those who have taken my seminar will hear familiar language, the rhetoric of rights, and especially of universal human rights, inalienable, self-evident human rights, has become nothing less than the dominant moral language of our time. And therefore, insofar as it has that status, we need to take seriously its genealogies in various settings. And my argument is that thanks to the force field of the Cold War, the way the Cold War heightened the importance of certain areas and certain issues, that relatively small number of Soviet dissidents played a disproportionate role in placing human rights on a global map, and that without the Cold War, that probably wouldn't have happened. I don't think you have to have paid special attention, just ordinary scanning of headlines, to grasp that this language and these ideas of rights are continuing to play a catalytic role in the uprisings that we are now observing in the Middle East, and that the place of small but notable dissident movements in a whole host of countries, from Iran to China and in between, is still a vital issue today and may become more vital in the near future. So, back to this question, when did you become a dissident? When did your eyes open? This was the version of the question that was posed by foreigners when they met Soviet dissidents in exile. But there was another indigenous Soviet version of this question as well, and it was posed in an article in the main Soviet newspaper, Pravda, in the fall of 1973, to the person of Andrei Sakharov, who by that time was the leading the leading figure of the dissident movement. A worker, in a letter to the editor of Pravda, wrote the following about Sakharov and the charges of treason that were being leveled against him. "My comrades and I," wrote this worker, who noted that he was a hero of socialist labor, "My comrades and I cannot understand how someone who has been raised under Soviet rule, whose education and professional status were provided by the toil of common laborers, can so unscrupulously libel our way of life." Now, despite the rather polemical tone of this question, I think it actually gets at a genuinely perplexing issue in a deeper way than the simple "when did you become a dissident" question does. And that is the question of how did these kinds of individuals emerge from that kind of society? How do we understand the rise of a dissident movement from within the belly, if you will, of the Soviet system itself. Since without exception, all of the leading dissidents were born, raised, and educated. As this writer says in the letter to Pravda, all of them were born and raised and fed and indoctrinated by the Soviet Union, by Soviet society. The answer to that question, I think, is undergoing something resembling a paradigm shift right now. The old approach used to be that the dissidents were antipodes. They were reactors to, opposites of, state-sanctioned ideology and practices. And the assumption, as I mentioned at the outset, was that somehow they had access to foreign sources that allowed them to step outside the milieu of Soviet society. And when I say outside, I mean in two ways. The argument has had two versions. Chronologically outside, that these people were able to pick up on the remnants of the legacy of the 19th century Russian intelligentsia, that they became, in a sense, the avatars of that intelligentsia post-1917, after the Russian Revolution. And the other version is that they were little liberals. They were like micro-liberals running around, having somehow been infected by Western ideas. Whichever version you take, though, the idea is that somehow the motivating force here is something either chronologically or geographically outside the Soviet Union itself. And my approach to this question has been actually diametrically opposed to this. Rather than study Soviet dissidents as something wholly apart from and antagonistic to Soviet society, and remember the word dissident comes from the Latin meaning he who sits apart or separate from. Rather than that, I'm trying to see the Soviet dissident movement as a product of the Soviet order itself, nourished by Soviet sources. And more broadly, I'm trying to see this as an example, and I think there are many across history, of how an orthodoxy can give rise to its own heresy. That orthodoxies create the ingredients out of which heresies can be constructed. As Andrea Malrich once put it, this is one of the figures that I mentioned early on, in that same essay, Will the Soviet Union Survive Until 1984, he said, "The first Marxist revolution took place in our country, and it is in our country that the process of overcoming that revolution from within has first begun." So, how did this process of overcoming a revolution from within actually work? How did it unfold? I want to do a brief tour with you, if you'll bear with me, through some of the major turning points of the dissident movement and how it arrived at the position that we associate it with today, that is, as defenders of universal human rights within the Soviet setting. So the story begins in the 1960s with what amounts to a kind of indirect literary approach to expressing non-standard or non-conformist ideas. There are various markers along the way: Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, various other works of fiction and poetry that created huge ripples among readers in the Soviet Union, and when they made their way west, even greater ripples abroad. But the essentially literary approach to dissenting viewpoints is transformed by the arrest of two writers in the fall of 1965, one named Andrei Sinyavsky, the other named Yuli Daniel, both of whom had published their work abroad under pseudonyms so as to continue living and working in the Soviet Union, and who were eventually unmasked by the KGB and put on trial the following spring in 1966 for anti-Soviet slander. This trial became a kind of cause célèbre all over the world. Communist parties in the West, writers' clubs in the West all spoke up on behalf of the writers and against the idea that you could put people on trial for works of fiction. It was one thing to put people on trial for programmatic statements calling for revolutionary uprisings or the assassination of Soviet leaders or even the dismantling of the Soviet system, but it was another thing to try someone for the words of a fictional character who may or may not have represented either the narrator of the story or the author himself, collapsing the distance between author and character. And in response to this trial, there are a series of demonstrations and protest movements and petition campaigns that fold into this phenomenon ever-growing numbers, especially of intellectuals, but also of students and others, mostly in Moscow and Leningrad, the two major cities, but as we now know from archival sources, to a much broader array of Soviet cities. It's tempting to see some of this activity as a parallel to the American civil rights movement, which was unfolding at virtually the same time, and interestingly, about which there was a lot of reporting in the Soviet press. So people who read a lot in the Soviet Union could keep abreast of developments in the United States. But the closer you look, the more the differences leap out than the similarities. The main tactic of this burgeoning Soviet civil rights movement was to appeal to Soviet law itself, was to appeal to the civil rights clauses of the Soviet Constitution in an attempt to make them real and to put limits on what the government could do by highlighting the constraints that were already in place, at least on paper, in the form of the Soviet Constitution. And insofar as it was appealing to existing Soviet constitutional law and simply asking the government to obey its own laws, this is something that I would call a movement of civil obedience, in direct contrast to the techniques of civil disobedience that characterized the American civil rights movement, where certain local laws, Jim Crow laws in the American South, were deliberately violated, knowing that people who violated them would suffer the consequences of arrest, or worse, at the hands of a racist police force, but hoping that by highlighting those laws, by drawing attention to them at the national level, that federal law, and in particular the Supreme Court, would come in and overturn and transform local Jim Crow legislation. That's the logic of the civil disobedience movement in the United States. Break the law in order to change the law by highlighting the indefensible nature of those local laws. I'm going to return to that analogy in a moment when I come back to the Soviet case. If there was a foreign influence on the Soviet dissident movement, it was not so much on the level of Western or American ideas about rights infiltrating into Soviet kitchens and underground publications. It was rather in the form of Western media attention. As many of you know, there's this term samizdat, or self-publishing, that describes the technique Soviet dissidents used to disseminate their works under the radar screen of official censorship. But there was also something called tamizdat, which was over-there publishing, where the idea is to smuggle your work abroad, have it published abroad, either in Russian or in a Western language, and then, if possible, smuggled back into the Soviet Union, or at least talked about in the West, so that your case and your ideas could achieve some kinds of prominence. The power of the Western media, and particularly of the Western fascination with dissidents that I described earlier, had the effect of shining a very bright light on certain individuals who were highlighted as the leaders or the moving forces of the movement, had the effect of assuming that those people were anti-Soviet or anti-communist, and of leaving other people and other phenomena in the shadows. The most powerful, and I think from a technical or media studies standpoint, most interesting example of this are what the Russians used to call the voices, which was shorthand for the shortwave radio broadcasts by Western countries, the BBC, the Voice of America, Radio Free Liberty, all of which had powerful broadcasting stations in Europe on the edge of the Eastern Bloc, and constantly broadcast programs in the languages of the Soviet Union, Russian, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Armenian, etc. And in effect, I'm going to suggest, were the precursors of what we now find happening via Facebook in places like Egypt and Iran and Libya. The Voice of America and other shortwave broadcast stations were able to absorb data, information, evidence, platforms coming out of the Soviet Union and disseminate them back into the Soviet Union. The technology looks crude by comparison with Facebook. It's much more centralized. Another important difference is, of course, that the Voice of America was owned by the United States and for many years financed covertly by the CIA, whereas Facebook is run by a private company. Another difference is, of course, that Facebook enables its users to control the flow and direction and extent of information much more actively than the shortwave radio broadcast stations ever did. Nonetheless, as a crude prototype, I think the analogy stands, because we know that across the 70s and 80s, more and more dissidents were creating texts, were writing text with the explicit idea of getting them broadcast back to millions of people, more than they could ever hope to reach by sharing crudely typed copies hand to hand among networks of friends. So in a way, we have a crude, but I think telling predecessor to the Facebook effect in what they called the Voices, a system for magnifying and spreading dissident opinion among the home population. Now, I mentioned the civil rights movement in the United States and the analogy to it, and I want to return to that now before I approach my conclusion. By 1968, which is the year the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in order to crush the Czech and Slovak version of a reform movement known as the Prague Spring, by 1968 it was fairly clear that the initial dissident strategy of using Soviet law, this kind of counterintuitive strategy of using Soviet law to contain the behavior of the Soviet state, was not working. Because the Prague Spring was articulating everything that the Soviet dissidents had dreamed of. Relaxing censorship, opening to the West, a more democratic form of governance. And if that was being put down by Soviet tanks, the hopes for a Moscow Spring, for an equivalent, were essentially being crushed symbolically at the same time. This produced a tremendous degree of soul-searching among dissenting figures, but the response, I think, is very telling and quite creative. The response was to more or less abandon the project of using Soviet law itself as a form of leverage against the Soviet state, and instead to appeal to international law, in whose orbit the Soviet Union was increasingly entering by signing various treaties and covenants sponsored by the United Nations. The culmination of this, of course, is the 1975 Helsinki Treaty, where the Soviet Union formally commits itself in a legally binding international treaty to observe the fundamental human rights that had been articulated in the Universal Declaration of 1948. In this sense, I think there is a useful analogy to the American civil rights movement. If in the American case, the logic was to bring in the federal government in an attempt to trump local racist laws, in the Soviet case, dissidents turned to the international community and to these international treaties in an attempt not so much to trump Soviet law as to force Soviet law to comply with its international counterpart, to which Moscow had signed these agreements. So again, there's a kind of choreography of going over the heads of one's local opponents. In this case, though, it means not going federal, but going global. This is the mechanism that I think unintentionally globalized human rights, not just as a vocabulary, as a talk that could be talked in convenient moments, but actually as a set of practices that were now demanding to be enforced because they were part of legally binding treaties between the two superpowers and the Europeans as well. So I'm arguing for a global analogy to what happened on a local and federal level inside the United States. Finally, I want to return to this question that I mentioned at the outset about whether the movement for human rights in the Soviet Union, and perhaps generally, is, at the end of the day, hopelessly utopian. Whether it marks an excessively abstract, disembodied commitment to certain self-evident but also easy moral values, and refuses to get involved in the political struggle and tug of war that is part of actual contestation over the common good. When we ask about whether human rights in the Soviet setting was utopian, we're actually dealing with two questions embedded in one. The first question is, did the specificities of the Soviet setting make human rights there de facto a utopian project? Was that simply an unrealistic agenda for reform or for exit from the system? And the second, broader question is, are human rights by nature, regardless of setting, a utopian undertaking, and analogous to earlier utopian schemes, among them communism itself? Now, I think it's fair to say that very few people ever, I certainly don't do this, ever identify their own ideas as being utopian. It's always the other guy's ideas who are utopian. That's a label that's attached by skeptics and opponents to the other side's agenda. And so I feel like I ought to confess outright that I'm in the camp that does not regard human rights as utopian. And I say that on the assumption that when we say utopian, we say it in the strict, vigorous sense of the word, and aren't referring to any project to make the world a better place in any way. I mean a utopian project is one that aspires to a perfect order, and hence an implicitly unrealizable order. Furthermore, utopian projects, to my mind, are almost always associated with the idea of transforming human beings and creating a better kind of human being, whether it was the Puritans or the socialists, or for that matter, the Zionists. There is an interesting line to be drawn between projects that are about transforming human nature itself and improving it, creating, as Trotsky put it, a better edition of humankind. With that distinction in mind, I think the human rights agenda represents a non-utopian, a non-totalizing approach to eliminating certain perceived evils. And I have to admit the list of those perceived evils has mushroomed over time to a point where it's almost unmanageable now. But typically human rights advocates, and their Soviet counterparts certainly fit this claim, I think, do not argue that instituting a human rights regime will solve all problems. And the claim to solve all problems is one of the hallmarks of utopian thought, let alone produce a perfect society. More importantly, though, I think it's in the very nature of human rights claims, those having to do with civil and political rights especially, that even where they insist on the right of the bearer of this or that civil or political right to express thoughts or to practice religion in a certain way or to associate, gather publicly with like-minded people or to form associations, all of the classic liberties of speech in the press and assembly, that even the most militant defense of those kinds of rights contributes absolutely nothing, says absolutely nothing, dictates absolutely nothing about the content of that thought and that speech, those gatherings and those associations. Even the most militant advocacy of human rights has no voice or no opinion as to the wisdom of adopting a particular position about whether it's a good idea to exercise a given right in a particular manner or in a particular situation. And this almost indifference to content and insistence on certain formal procedural norms, again, I think distinguishes the human rights style of thought from anything utopian. In fact, within the Soviet setting, just to return to my particular case study, within the Soviet setting, the appeal to human rights was almost always, in the most literal sense, a conservative gesture, calling for the defense of existing rights, rights already enshrined in the Soviet Constitution. And behind the activism of people who came to the defense of Sinyavsky and Daniel, or who formed various human rights committees or the Helsinki Watch Committees after 1975, behind all of those groups lay a very shrewd capacity to engage in cost-benefit analysis. Again, the antithesis of utopian thought. So, if I can conclude and then open the floor up to any questions or comments that you might have. I don't think we should study Soviet dissidents as surrogate liberals who were fighting our fight within the Soviet Union in the context of the Cold War. Instead, I would turn to the indigenous factors in Soviet society itself, the aspirations that were introduced by socialism itself, and in particular by the constitutions, the various constitutions that the Soviet Union produced. I think there's a great danger in viewing human rights as an American export product or a Western export product, and that by attempting to derive them or embed them in Soviet civilization itself, I certainly don't mean to create an image of the dissidents as people who were not independently minded or were not courageous in their ability to break with certain Soviet practices. On the contrary, for me, the moral drama of how I became a dissident or how my eyes were opened is even greater and worthy of greater respect once we see the depth and the length of the journey actually traveled. Thank you. So I'd be glad to take any questions or comments that you might have. Yes?
How important was the Refusenik movement to the overall dissident movement in the Soviet Union?
Just to make sure everybody heard the question, how important was the Refusenik movement to the broader dissident movement in the Soviet Union? It's an excellent question. Very important. A disproportionate number of the dissidents were of Jewish background, even those who did not self-identify culturally, much less religiously, as Jews. So on the level of personnel, there was a tremendous degree of overlap between the two movements. The dissident movement de facto became a kind of clearinghouse or umbrella organization for many, many different ethnically based or religiously based movements, whether it's Ukrainian nationalists, Jews seeking to emigrate, ethnic Germans seeking to emigrate. I wouldn't say there was exactly reciprocity on the other side, because many Refuseniks were extremely worried about being associated with the dissident movement, because their agenda, after all, the Refuseniks' agenda, was to leave, not to change the Soviet Union, not to reform it, not to make it better, not to allow it to realize its full socialist potential, but just to get out. So they realized that there was a certain political risk in being associated with people who actually wanted to reform the Soviet system. Perhaps the most important thing, though, was that the Refusenik movement, and for those of you who might not be aware, Refusenik refers to people who had been refused permission to emigrate, literally gone to the visa office and been turned down, and they were dubbed Refuseniks by their sympathizers in the West. Perhaps the most important role that that movement played was that it had a natural constituency of concerned fellow Jews abroad, whether it was in the United States or England or Canada or Israel or where have you. And that meant that the Refuseniks were a very high-profile group, much more high-profile than any of the other individual national or ethnic or religious currents within the larger dissident phenomenon. So when I spoke earlier about the power of the Western gaze and of Western media to cast a bright light on certain areas and leave others in the shadows, you've given me Exhibit A for that argument, because the Refuseniks attracted a huge amount of attention, even to the point where some people maintain that the right to emigrate became agenda item number one of the dissident movement, which is not true. The Soviet government liked the idea of tainting the dissidents as a bunch of Jews who were up to nothing but getting out while the getting was good. But in fact, the dissident movement struggled to balance the right to emigrate with civil rights that would have been of interest to people who wanted to remain in the Soviet Union, but in a reformed Soviet Union. If you're interested, there's a great book that came out last fall called When They Come For Us, We'll Be Gone by Gal Beckerman. It's a history of the Refusenik movement on both the Soviet and American sides. It's kind of a dual history that converges. Yes?
Yeah, I was interested in the comparison you drew between the U.S. civil rights movement kind of appealing to higher national power and the Soviets appealing to global power. Now, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about the enforcement side of it. And then I think there may be some differences, and I'm not sure, as to how much power kind of the UN and this global human rights movement they've had to actually enforce.
Yes.
As opposed to the U.S. context where the national government had maybe more power to do so.
Absolutely. The national government, when it chose to, could send in the National Guard to places like Oxford, Mississippi, and Little Rock, Arkansas, to enforce federal law over the wishes of local officials. It wouldn't have occurred to any sane person to get the United Nations to send an army into the Soviet Union. And everybody knew that, including the Soviets. So you're right, the enforcement mechanisms were very different. But when we're dealing with human rights, in that era especially, the power of moral shaming and moral persuasion was the main weapon. And that was something that was fully mobilizable, if you will, on the international level. And I think the Soviet dissidents actually deserve a lot of the credit for believing that those mechanisms might actually have an impact. They're the ones who actually had to alert the West to the fact that massive violations of the Helsinki Treaty were occurring inside the Soviet Union, and that this is an intolerable thing for the other parties who signed that treaty. On the American side, I think there was a rather cynical assumption that this was a symbolic exchange of favors. Helsinki recognized the post-war borders in Eastern Europe and essentially legalized Soviet expansion. It was the treaty that ended the Second World War, de facto. And in return for that, Moscow paid lip service to certain human rights norms. Nobody, I think, really expected that any of those things would have much traction. But the Soviet dissidents were the ones who said, you know, look, the Kremlin signed this, and you're being made a fool if you don't insist on the enforcement of this treaty. So, in effect, the first shaming ritual was to shame the West into trying to stand up to what it had agreed to with the Soviets. And once that was accomplished, then, of course, conservatives in the United States especially, but also organized labor was only too happy to adopt that strategy and to use Helsinki to constantly, as the Soviets put it, interfere in their domestic affairs. But you're right to point out the limits of the analogy. Yes, Anishka.
I'm really interested in this idea of critiquing the Marxist ideology from within as a way of departing from it. And I'm only familiar with the Polish parallel to this. And there, I would be curious if you see a generational effect. In other words, in the Polish case, 1956 was so much about the critique of Marxism from within. And by the time you get to 68, there's a new generation of students who are much more creating a hybrid of the communist and Western democratic ideals.
Yeah. Yes, there is. And thank you for drawing out that nuance, because the original version of a Marxist opposition to Soviet communism was, let's go back to Lenin. Let's go back to October 1917. Let's go back to the sacred texts of Marxism-Leninism and recapture the original promise of the revolution. And this was the kind of thinking that inspired people who I would not call dissidents, but Leninists, who formed underground cells and were thinking about armed uprising, sort of reenacting the Bolshevik, the archetypal moment in Bolshevik history, which was revolutionary seizure of power of the state. By the time you get to the 60s, the late 60s, it's not that that phenomenon has disappeared, but it's being challenged and I would argue displaced by a new version. The version that says, let's use the current tools in place in Soviet jurisprudence and the criminal code and general norms, political norms, not to accomplish a revolution, but to accomplish a meta-revolution, a revolution in the way revolutions happen. Let's achieve the effect of fundamental systemic change, not by the application of violence, because we've seen only too well what that produces, but by a kind of internal reform program, using the tools of the Soviet state apparatus. For the dissidents, that strategy took the place of invoking constitutional norms. But there were plenty of other people who were not part of an identifiable movement who we now call in-system reformers, who joined the Communist Party and who thought they could quietly modify things from within the inner sanctum of power itself. Most of them were frustrated in that attempt because they were defeated by their conservative rivals, but a number of them became close advisors to Gorbachev eventually and did have an impact on transforming the Communist Party from within. The problem is that by that time, the party was such a brittle organization that the attempt to reform it actually ended up breaking it. But there is, I think you're right, there is a generational shift and a different toolkit that's being applied, both from within, but the resources they're drawing on are quite different. If there are no further questions, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the pizza and perhaps the talk as well. Thank you.
Hi, just want to introduce myself. My name's